Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to what is going to be our fourth unit of the Humanities class. And this particular unit is on Nordic culture and Nordic literature. Now, why do we segue from religion into this particular unit? Well, it's basically because we have so far in the course been focusing on Middle Eastern and Mediterranean cultures and sources and that sort of milieu, that sort of area. And we're going to transition after the fall of Rome into the medieval era, into medievalism. But in order to get more used to or kind of feel the transition into that more northern part of Europe and into the medieval era of history, I like to begin by giving us a preview of Nordic culture and Nordic religion or Nordic literature, just to sort of get the flavor of the culture before we have a transition into the more medieval Christian period of history. Okay. Now, Norse mythology, Norse culture has become particularly popular in the past few years and the past few decades. I know there's been more innovative works on it. We've had more of a sort of revival of it. We have Marvel to thank in part for that with the emergence of Thor. If you're a big gamer, you'll know the series of games for God of War, which usually also focused on Greek mythology, shifted itself into Norse mythology, been very popular. So those sort of images, those sort of cultural icons speak back to this era of history and this kind of section of literature. Now, what we're going to do is not do a thorough deep dive into it. We're going to talk just very briefly about the region and the kind of culture that emerges out of it. Then we're going to talk more about the creation story and the end of the world story. The apocalypse, if you want, the eschatos of the Norse religion or the Norse culture. And then just comment on that a little bit. Then we're going to look at just one hero. We're going to look at Sigurd for a little bit, or at least one section of Sigurd's story. And then we're going to take a longer video, taking a look at probably the most famous piece of literature to come out of this region of the world and this section of history, which is Beowulf. Okay. So that's kind of what lies ahead for us. Now, when we think of Scandinavia, when we think of the Nordic regions, I like to have my students, brainstorm or just talk to each other or even do a little bit of research and try to understand what kind of images come to your mind, what sort of landscapes come to your mind, what biome do you picture? And it's basically this, as we see here, this kind of great frozen north, these large expanses of hilly, mountainous, rocky terrain with like minimal forests, more kind of, lush fields, but lots and lots of snow, ice, really cold seas, volcanoes, if you're talking about particular areas in Scandinavia. And these great sort of North Sea, if you go back, online and you look at the North Sea, if you look at, the regions in Iceland that people like to film in, especially for volcanoes, you really get the vibe of this very, very well, of this kind of environment. It's rated R, I believe, so I have to recommend it with parents' approval. But go watch the movie The Northman by A24 Studios, and it really captures the aesthetics and the tone of the Nordic culture very, very well, and it's shot just beautifully. So if you go even on YouTube and watch a few safe clips of The Northman, you really understand sort of what we're talking about here. Okay, so that's Scandinavia a little bit. Now, as we read here, we know that the Norse myths and the Norse culture come out of Scandinavia. Okay, Northern Europe, going to be important for us just to understand the kind of roots and the soil where medievalism is going to kind of spread out of, or where it's going to come from, essentially. So if you are someone of Northern European descent, this is sort of your bread and butter. This is sort of where we come from, right? Just as Greek mythology is sort of where we come from if we are of Southern European descent, right? So that's the kind of simple equation we have here. But as you see, this particular region of the world contains many modern day cultures, or not many cultures, I would say, but many countries, right? So a lot of the countries that we discuss, like Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, all these kind of stuff, this is all in Scandinavia, all in that Nordic region. Okay, now the geography in more specifics, wide range of mountains, plains, lakes, frozen seas, all this kind of stuff. So there is a large presence of water, right? It's a very navally welcoming sort of area. The warmest weather, usually about 73 degrees, right? So like if we're up here in upstate New York, enjoying a 73-degree day weather, that's like a really good summer. That's like a really comfortable summer day. You know, usually right now we're kind of pushing like 80s, sometimes 90s. I had a couple times that it goes to 100. This is not so in the Scandinavian region. You know, a comfortable, really peak summer day will be at 73 degrees. And then the coldest goes down to 5 degrees, right? So there is a chilling air. I only visited kind of the northern parts of England once in my life, and I immediately kind of felt that damp chill that goes right to your bones. And this is sort of what we need to picture the North as being like. As Scandinavia is really characterized by that sort of cold. Now, we have a culture that is made up of, as it says here, multiple kingdoms and peoples and tribes that follow a polytheistic pagan religion, often warring with each other through different tribes, different regions, different groups, all this kind of stuff. But they're pagans, right? They're polytheistic pagans, very similar to what we saw in ancient Greece, but of a very, very different flavor, as we're going to see. So the first myth that I have my students explore is the creation myth, okay? Now, I got this website to work, which is if you use this URL, I'll link this one in the description for sure. It's called The Big Myth. And we use this at the beginning of our unit on Greek mythology. It's a fantastic website where you can go, as you can see, and explore and read about these different cultures and get their creation myths and a little bit more information. So if we go to the Norse creation myth, this is what we will be given, okay? Ginnungagapa was the great emptiness before there was a world or a living thing, right? So we begin with that emptiness again, right? Far to the south of Ginnungagapa was a fiery realm of Muspel, with its long, hot rivers full of poison and vast lakes of fire. Nothing could grow in this burning realm. The north was the dark and cold realm of Niflheim, where icy mountains spewed forth freezing rivers. Nothing could grow there either, where the sky was always dark and the mountains were blocks of solid ice. Okay, so we begin in the Norse creation story. And by the way, if you're following along with our notes, this is what it will look like. We're going to obviously have a couple notes on just the region and the characterization of those areas of Scandinavia. But for the creation myth, I want a couple of different things. I want basically 4 or 5 elements here. And what the role that these things have is. The first great elements in existence, what are those things? Well, there's things that are to the north and to the south. And as you can see, to the south, we have heat, we have fire, we have lava. To the north, we have a frozen expanse, okay? This is Niflheim and Muspel, okay? Now, fire and ice. Why do we see fire and ice being so prevalent in this particular culture's mythology and this particular culture's imagination? We'll talk about that later, but we just know that these are their big elements. They like ice, they like fire. These are the extremes that they're dealing with. Slowly over years and years and years, the fiery blasts from Muspel began to melt the icy mountains of Niflheim. Out of the melting ice, the giant Ymir emerged, the first being of the vast Ginnungagapa. Next to him, there emerged a cow from the ice. The cow licked the salt from the ice mountains, and Ymir drank the cow's milk. Ymir grew larger and larger. The cow licked away the entire mountains of ice. Slowly, she licked the ice from 2 more beings, this time the god Buri and his goddess wife. They had a son named Bor, and his son was named Odin, who became the king of all the gods. Okay, so we have a little bit of genealogy there, like we had back during the creation story of the Greeks. Now, the first two beings, we have Ymir and Ymir's cow, right? So totally different sort of imagery that we had from the Greek creation myths. With the Greeks, it was much more, these primordial elements, these, ethereal elemental beings. Here, it's giants and cows and this kind of stuff, right? It's a totally different flavor of mythology. Now, we go on. After the whole genealogy, we start here. Ymir was cruel and brutal. Odin and the other gods could no longer abide by his evil acts, and together the gods slew him. Ymir's huge body formed the earth. His blood became the sea, his flesh became the land, and his bones the mountains, and his hair the trees. Odin and the other gods formed the sky with his skull, held up by four towering pillars. Odin gathered sparks from the fiery depths of Muspel and created the sun and moon. These he set in the sky. As the sun and moon shone over the new world in the Ginnungagapa, the ice began to melt and plants and trees began to grow. The greatest tree of all was Yggdrasil, which grew in the very center of the earth. Its roots penetrated into the bottom of creation, and its leaves reached the very tops of the sky. Odin was satisfied with the new world and named it Midgard, the middle land. Okay, so we have here a typical pattern that we saw from our creation stories in the ancient Greek world, right? We can fill out who we know who the king of the gods is. We know the first two beings. We know Yggdrasil. We know Midgard. Okay. Now, similarities that we see so far. We see the primordial elements beginning the acts of creation or beginning the stages of creation. And we see the newer generations, the newer gods, struggling against their more primordial and more negatively behaving parents or elders. Like Ymir was the one here. The Ymir, the cruel giant, is very obviously reminiscent of Kronos or Uranus in Greek mythology, right? So we see that tyrannical, patriarchal sort of figure that we have to overthrow or struggle against. Now, Odin creates Yggdrasil. He kind of forms the world. So again, sort of adding structure to chaos, similar things we've seen before. And we continue here, but the world still needed people. On one of his walks, Odin found two fallen trees, an ash and an elm. He lifted them from the mud and formed the first man and woman from them. Odin breathed life into these beings, gave them reason and feelings, hearing and sight. He named the man Ask and the woman Embla. From these two sprang the entire human race. The humans had the task of looking after Midgard, while gods ascended to Asgard, their realm in heaven. However, not everyone was pleased with Odin's work. Ymir's giant sisters were still mourning his death and were looking for a way to take their revenge on the gods who killed him. They gathered at the foot of Yggdrasil and began to carve lines into it. Each line was a human life, filled with twists and turns, beginning with a man's birth and ending with his death. At the end of each line, they made a deep cut to ensure that humans would never be as powerful as the gods. These spells were so powerful that not even Odin could undo anything to change them. Thus, Yggdrasil became known as the Tree of Life, and humans knew death and suffering in their worlds. Okay, so we can see a couple bit of Genesis elements here as well. So we know that this is similar to Genesis in some regard. This version at least is very similar to Genesis. There are other versions which are far more pagan and mythical and not at all similar to the kind of Hebrew text that we've seen. But we see the same pattern here. We see the formation of the world from chaos. We see the organization from a tyrannical past, and we see the creation of the human beings and sort of their stewardship over creation. We also see an entrance of some negativity and suffering into the human realm, right? So those are obvious similarities that we see across cultures. Now, some distinctions that we see here that are particularly different. The creation is more complex from what we saw in the Greek stories and from what we see in Genesis. So the beginning with, the two realms, we kind of begin with that kind of diametrically opposed sort of areas. That is particularly unique. This formation of the world tree, Yggdrasil, is one of the most unique things about this myth. And it's this idea that all these different realms and almost worlds or dimensions are connected. And the ordering of those connected realms is, again, something very unique to this particular realm. We don't see that anywhere near as much as we do in, we don't see anything like this in the gospel, or I'm sorry, not the gospels, in Genesis or in the creation story of Greeks. So this is a quick little map, or a very kind of easy map of Yggdrasil. Now, one element of Yggdrasil that I want to focus on, and that's going to lead us into the next reading, is this little dude down here. Not very little, but this dude down here. This is, of course, what's his name? Jormungandr, the world serpent, who makes an appearance in pretty much all major, depictions of Norse myth. We saw him in the Captain America movie, on that little carving that hides the Tesseract. We see him very prevalently in the God of War video games, and we see him, of course, here, and we see him in most stories about Thor as well. We'll see why. But what is he doing? He's gnawing at the roots of creation. And this is foreshadowing, obviously, what's going to happen in this particular pantheon, in this particular worldview, is that, yes, Odin has established Yggdrasil. He has kind of divided the realms together. He's unified them and also kind of ordered them to be homes for different area or different beings in creation. But even so, we have forces that are at work that are slowly eating away at the stability of this system. And those forces exist below the world, below our consciousness, below our understanding, in the form of the world serpent. Now, the world serpent, I think, is clearly evocative of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. We see that connection. If you are familiar with Mesopotamian mythology, he's very similar to Tiamat. If you're familiar with Egyptian mythology, he's very similar to the demon Apophis, right? And they're serpents of night who comes to devour the day. So this element, or this sort of recurring image, this recurring symbol of the destructive serpent, the destructive dragon that kind of lurks beneath the world and is going to bring about ruin and destruction, is a feature, a symbol, an archetype that is firmly implanted in the human imagination or the human mind. Now, why is this? I think clearly, ladies and gents, we're going to talk about this a little bit more if we end up doing a psych class. But if you watched our video on symbolism, if you watched our videos on tragedy and the hero's journey, the pattern that we're seeing work out here is the same pattern that we would see in tragedy, in any tragic story, where there is an issue, there is a hamartia, there is something that our heroes or our main characters are ignoring or are ignorant of. And that something, that factor, that flaw, that whatever the issue is going to slowly eat away at the structure and the peace and happiness and order of our character, and thus bring about the end of the narrative, right? That is the tragic story. That is the tragic structure. So we see in this particular creation myth, or in this particular mythology, a very tragic tone, a very tragic structure built in from the very beginning. And this, of course, leads us to the myth of Ragnarök. Okay, the myth of the twilight of the gods, or Götterdämmerung, as the opera writer Richard Wagner would call it, right? So let's go over to that one real quick. And we're going to skip, this is a little bit out of order, but we're going to go right to the myth of Ragnarök, okay? I want us to read the story, summarize the events, describe the overall mood. It's going to be really important. Identify the imagery, potential symbols, all this kind of stuff. And then we're going to answer this last question together once we get there, okay? So if we go over to Ragnarök, we see this. It's only about a page long, so not too terrible to read. It says, first paragraph, someday, whenever the Norns, those inscrutable spinners of fate, decree it, there shall come a great winter, unlike any other the world has yet seen. The biting winds will blow snow from all directions. The warmth of the sun will fail, plunging the earth into unprecedented cold. This winter shall last for the length of 3 normal winters, with no summers in between. Mankind will become so desperate for food and other necessities of life that all laws and morals will fall away, leaving only the bare struggle for survival. It will be an age of swords and axes. Brothers will slay brother. Brother will slay brother. Father will slay son. Son will slay father. Okay. So we have this prediction, as you can see, the difference of the myth of Ragnarok to other myths that we have seen is it is not set in the distant past. It is a foretelling myth. It is sort of a prophecy, if you want, of Ragnarok, which again is unique among ancient myths. We don't typically have such a vivid depiction of the elements of the future as we do here. But what is this telling us is going to happen? Something awful is coming. Something terrible is going to happen in the future. It will be accompanied by natural disasters or natural hardships. It will cause societal struggles, and it will be noteworthily much worse than things that you have seen before. Okay, the second one. The wolves Skull and Hati, who have hunted the sun and the moon through the skies since the beginning of time, will at last catch their prey. The stars too will disappear, leaving nothing but a black void in the heavens. Yggdrasil, the great tree that holds the cosmos together, will tremble, and all the trees, even the mountains, will fall to the ground. The chain that has been holding back the monstrous wolf Fenrir will snap, and the beast will run free. Jormungand, that is the world serpent, the mighty serpent who dwells at the bottom of the ocean and encircles the land, will rise from the depths, spilling the seas over all the earth as he makes landfall. Okay. So the great primordial monsters, the great primordial forces will begin to emerge and will start to devour the structured world as we know it. Paragraph 3. These convulsions will shake the ship Naglfar free from its moorings. This ship, which is made from the fingernails and toenails of the dead men and women, will sail easily over the flooded earth. Its crew will be an army of giants, the forces of chaos and destruction, and its captain will be none other than Loki, the traitor to the gods, who will have broken free of the chains in which the gods have bound him. Okay, so we have again the return of the giants, the return of these primordial enemies to the order and structure of the gods and men. And we have a particular god here mentioned, of course, Loki, famous by any Marvel fan as the traitor to the gods, but also, as we know, the trickster god, the god that sort of sets issues or sets tragedies in motion. Okay, he's at the captaining helm of all this. Excuse me. So, what's next? Fenrir, that is the wolf, with fire blazing from his eyes and nostrils, will run across the earth with his lower jaw on the ground and his upper jaw against the top of the sky, devouring everything in his path. Jormungand will spit his venom over all the world, poisoning land, water, and air alike. Okay, so again, the wolf by land, the serpent by sea, destroying the world as we know it, okay, causing more and more destruction. The dome of the sky will be split, and from the crack shall emerge 5 giants from Muspelheim. Their leader shall be Surtur, with a flaming sword brighter than the sun in his hand. As they march across the Bifrost, that is the sword, or the bridge, of course, connecting the worlds. The Rainbow Bridge, Asgard, home of the gods, the bridge will break and fall behind them. An ominous horn blast will ring out. This will be Heimdall, the divine sentry, glowing the Jalahorn. I'm definitely mispronouncing that. The Jalahorn, to announce the arrival of the moment that the gods have feared. Odin will anxiously consult the head of Mimir, the wisest of all beings, for counsel. Okay, so in other words, it's time for the cataclysmic end of the world and the battle that must precede it. Okay. The gods will decide to go to battle, even though they know what the prophecies have foretold concerning the outcome of this clash. They will arm themselves and meet their enemies on the battlefield called Vigrir. Okay, interesting point. The gods apparently and all the beings of this mythology know what the outcome of this battle will be. And yet, excuse me, and yet they go anyways, right? They charge anyways. They charge into what they know is going to be their ultimate defeat anyways. Odin will fight Fenrir, and by his side will be Einherjar, the host, the Einherjar, is usually how it's pronounced, or the Einir, the host of his chosen human warriors, whom he has kept in Valhalla for just this moment. Odin and the champions of men will fight more valiantly than anyone has ever fought before, but it will not be enough. Fenrir will swallow Odin and his men. Then one of Odin's sons, Vidar, burning with rage, will charge the beast to avenge his father. On one of his feet shall be the shoe that has been crafted for this very purpose. It has been made from all the scraps of leather that human shoemakers have ever discarded. And with it, Vidar will hold open the monster's mouth. Then he will stab his sword through the wolf's throat, killing him. Another wolf, Gram, and the god Tyr will slay each other. Heimdall and Loki will do the same, putting a final end to the trickster's treachery, but costing the gods one of their best in the process. Thor and Jormungand, those age-old foes, will both finally have their chance to kill the other. Thor succeeding in felling the great snake with the blows of his hammer, but the serpent will have covered him in so much venom that he will not be able to stand for much longer. He will take 9 paces before falling dead himself and adding his blood to the already saturated soil of Vigrir. And then finally, last stage of this whole process in this myth, Surtur will plunge his sword into the world, setting it ablaze into one great furnace of fire and ash. Then the remains of the world will sink into the sea, and there will be nothing left but void. Creation and all that has occurred since will be completely undone, as if it had never happened at all. Okay, so that is the myth of Ragnarok. Now, we can summarize those events as we kind of were doing it in about 3 or 4 bullets. The mood of this particular story, my God, is it dreadful, right? It is so ominous. It is so downbeat. It's so dim and dark and sort of foreboding. There's a little strain of heroism there with the fighting that's happening, and the gods knowing that they're going to die, but this sort of idea that we're going to go down fighting. That's a little bit positive, but again, it's all for naught in some way because everything is destroyed. Then for the imagery and symbols here, we have the destruction of nature, the overturning of nature. We have the reemergence of primordial monsters, right? So all those old arcane symbols kind of come back to attack. We see fire. Excuse me. Pardon me. We see fire be, I think, the dominant symbol here, especially in the end, right? The burning away of all things, the sinking into the water, beneath the waves. Now, for my final question here, how would you describe the overall tone and mood of the Norse religion? And this is our last conversation for today. We see, ladies and gentlemen, that the Norse mythology, the Norse culture, and as we're going to see, Norse literature has a very present downbeat and you could say pessimistic sort of tone, with the essential idea that the world will come to an end. It's this very, not entirely nihilistic, but very close to nihilistic mentality. It's this idea that all of our efforts will fundamentally be in vain. And as a result, we have a particularly unique mythology here in that we don't have an end of the world story in most other creation myths. Even if you want to use the Bible as sort of a mythology text, especially in the book of the Revelation of John, it's a positive ending. There's an optimistic ending to that one. Here, not so much. So one of the questions I have after we go through these notes, we go through these readings, is the obvious kind of relationship between the Scandinavian region and the imagery and mood of its mythology and its subsequent religion. What is the similarity? Well, I think the obvious one, guys, is that you grow up or you kind of emerge as a culture in this particularly harsh and brutal environment. With a relative lack of sunlight, a lack of warmth, a very inhospitable sort of region characterized by extremes in weather, whether it be through the lavas that that spurts out of particular places in Greenland and Iceland, or the extreme colds that pervade all around you. Depending on the region, there's places where the daylight is not sufficiently present, and nights are particularly overt and particularly oppressive. I think that has to play a role in a region's culture and the kind of mood and the mentality that they're in. So as a result of living in this relatively pessimistic and relatively dark and dire sort of region, you have then developed a mythology that is pessimistic as well. Okay. Couple more things before we call it a day. The more you look at the motifs of this myth of Ragnarok, the more that you're going to start to see them sort of echo out into other literature that we're going to read. The influence of the Nordic imagery, the Nordic culture, is going to pervade the medieval era, and as a result, will then pervade a lot of contemporary novels, a lot of contemporary works as well. And the motif I'm referring to particularly is this idea that when two great powers are struggling against each other, their struggle will result in mutual destruction. So if you notice through the myth of Ragnarök, whenever we see a god fighting another being, pardon me, what eventually happens is that there might be an initial victor, but they're both dead in the process. They both die rather in the process, adding to that pessimistic tone. Okay, keep that in mind, because that's going to be a factor in future works that we look at. An additional factor that we have here, or additional motif here, is this sort of waiting period before we have an eventual catastrophe, right? We have a catastrophe that has been prophesied, a catastrophe that is coming, that is on its way, and we only have a brief respite from it, a brief break from it before the outside forces break into our world and destroy it, essentially. So the metaphor that I was always given in class by my professors was the metaphor, if you want to look back at our symbolism and metaphor video, is a sort of metaphor for life of the Viking kind of mead hall, or the Scandinavian mead hall. What does this look like? What is the metaphor here? We have a structure, this wooden structure, walled in area, where inside there is warmth, there is safety, and there is comfort in the form of company, merriment, drinks, food, fire, all this kind of stuff. Positive environments. The walls prevent what is outside from getting in. And what is it that's outside? What is it that contrasts this? Outside, there is darkness, there is cold, there is death, there is harshness, there is despair, essentially. Now, what I think the Ragnarok myth is kind of demonstrating to us metaphorically is that structure, that imaginative structure, that metaphor of a way of looking at the world is there, but it will not last. That darkness will eventually break into your world and will destroy it. And then we will be plunged into this final darkness, essentially, into death. That is the motif, the gist, the mood of Scandinavian mythology. It is ultimately it is a pessimistic and in part a culture or a tradition of despair, if you want. Okay, it's very negative. Now, that's their contribution, if you want. That's the soil that this culture is growing up in. Now, what we're going to do next class is we're going to read a story of probably their most famous hero, which is Sigurd. Now, we're not going to read about his tale with Brunhilde, but we will read him and his battle with the dragon Fafnir. We will then, after having that wonderful sample of Nordic literature, Nordic tradition, we will then shift into Beowulf, where everything we discussed here about the culture of the Nordic regions and the tone of the Nordic regions is going to become very important and become very essential for us to understand what's going on in Beowulf. Okay, so that's an introduction to the Nordic culture, Nordic sensibilities. When we see you again, we will talk about this guy here, good old Sigurd, and we will see how he fares against the first dragon we've actually seen in this particular course, which is going to be the dragon Fafnir. But until then, have a wonderful day. Bye.